Miss Marple and the Bride Who Married Her Sister's Husband, a Miss Marple, Mystery Chapter 1. The wedding at St. Mary Mead, garden of St. Mary Mead Church, looked particularly charming that Saturday morning. Climbing roses covered the stone wall with their crimson petals, and daisies dotted the freshly cut lawn with touches of ivory and gold. Miss Marple, sitting on the wooden bench in the shade of the ancient yew tree, watched the guests arrive in their gleaming cars, her hands busy knitting a pale grey scarf, moved with the precision of someone who had spent 73 years perfecting the art of observation, while pretending to be completely absorbed in her work. The bride was Helena Ashworth, a 32-year-old woman whose beauty had remained undiminished, thanks to a combination of favorable genes and a considerable amount of time spent in front of the mirror. Her wedding dress, designed by a renowned London dressmaker, costs more than most of the villagers in St. Mary Mead earned in a year. But what Miss Marple found truly fascinating was not the Alencon lace or the hand-sewn pearls, but the way Helena avoided looking at certain guests during the ceremony. The groom was Christopher Bancroft, a 45-year-old man whose first marriage had ended just 18 months earlier with the death of his wife, Margaret. Christopher possessed that kind of appeal that combined the solidity of broad shoulders with the gentleness of pale blue eyes that seemed incapable of harboring a dishonest thought. He worked as a solicitor in Nottingham, and his family had lived at Thornfield House for 4 generations. What made this link particularly interesting, however, was the presence of Helena's sister, Vivian Ashworth, who was married to David Ashworth, Christopher's younger brother. Miss Marple noticed the way Vivian looked at Christopher during the exchange of vows. It wasn't the look of an affectionate sister-in-law, but something more charged, more complicated. Vivian was a 35-year-old woman, thin to the point of fragility, with that kind of nervous elegance that suggested both refinement and emotional instability. Her marriage to David had been the subject of gossip in the village for the past 5 years. Everyone knew that David spent most nights at his club in London, that Vivian frequented the doctor's consulate more often than her own home. After the ceremony, the reception was held in the back garden of Thornfield House. The tables were covered with white linen tablecloths, and local flowers decorated every corner. Champagne flowed, conversations buzzed, and Miss Marple found herself in her favourite spot, off to one side, observing it was around 3 in the afternoon when the caterer noticed that Margaret, not the deceased Margaret, but Christopher's teenage daughter, who was helping with the service that afternoon, seemed nervous. Then someone mentioned that they hadn't seen Christopher in over half an hour. Then someone shouted from inside the house. Christopher Bancroft's body was found in his study, lying on the Persian rug with a deep cut on his wrist. Beside him lay a silver letter opener, covered in blood. At first glance, everything pointed to suicide. A man consumed by guilt, perhaps. A man who couldn't bear the weight of his emotions. A man who chose to end his life, what Inspector Slack of the Nottingham Police Department failed to notice, but which Miss Marple observed as she slipped among the hysterical guests, calmly asking for a glass of water to soothe the nerves of everyone around her, was a series of small details that told a completely different story. First of all, the letter opener lying next to the body was definitely from Christopher's desk collection. Yes, but it had an unusual feature, a mother-of-pearl handle that glittered in the light. Miss Marple had seen that same style in someone else's hands just an hour before. Secondly, although the wound was deep and undoubtedly fatal, the blood spattering on the carpet formed a pattern that was too neat, too contained. Blood flowing from a severed wrist has a way of spreading, of dispersing, of creating chaos. This seemed planned, careful. Thirdly, and this was what truly caught Miss Marple's attention, the study door had been locked from the inside, or so everyone said. However, when she had briefly passed by before the discovery, she had seen the door latch in a position exactly halfway between open and closed, the kind of detail that would suggest that someone, very recently, had handled it carefully, while Inspector Slack paced the garden, taking hasty statements. Asking when anyone had last seen Christopher alive, Miss Marple quietly finished her point. She rolled up her pale grey scarf and put it in her bag with the care of someone who knows that cases like this require patience. Helena, the bride, was being comforted by her mother in a garden chair, but her eyes, red from tears, kept glancing back at the studio window. Vivian had disappeared. Chapter 2. The Secrets of the Village. Detective Inspector Slack was a burly man in his 60s, whose career had been built more on persistence than insight. As he questioned the guests in the drawing room of Thornfield House, his approach was direct, almost to the point of brutality. Who last saw Christopher? Did anyone notice anything unusual? Was there anyone who knew of any emotional problems that might have led to this? Miss Marple, sitting discreetly in the corner of the room, was still knitting. Inspector Slack had politely pointed her out when he arrived, acknowledging her presence as that of an unimportant old village woman. It was exactly as she liked to be perceived. Margaret Bancroft, Christopher's 16-year-old daughter, was the first to be properly questioned. She was a young woman with dark brown hair and the same pale blue eyes as her father. Her voice trembled as she described how her father had asked her to look after the guests, while he briefly stepped away to make some phone calls. This had happened around 2:45 p.m., she said. Was he agitated? Asked Inspector Slack. No, I don't think so, Margaret replied, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. He was in a good mood. He joked with me about not spilling champagne on the bride's dress. The inspector frowned. This didn't fit with his theory of a hasty suicide. Next, Helena, the girlfriend, was questioned. She appeared consumed by a combination of shock and something else that Miss Marple carefully identified as guilt. The young woman recounted how she had noticed Christopher leave, how she had waited for his return, how she had seen his sister Vivian loitering near the study door at about 2:45. Where is your sister now? Asked Inspector Slack. I don't know, Helena admitted, her eyes avoiding the inspector's. The last time I saw her was about 20 minutes ago. I thought maybe she'd gone to the bathroom. The inspector sent an officer to look for Vivian Ashworth. The officer reported that she was not at the house, in the gardens, or on the surrounding grounds. Her car, a dark blue Sunbeam Talbot, was no longer in the driveway. This, of course, changed the nature of the investigation almost instantly. Inspector Slack changed his theory. It was no longer suicide. It was murder, and Vivian Ashworth was the most obvious suspect. It is clear, the inspector announced to the room full of shocked guests, that Mrs. Ashworth has fled. The question we must ask is why? Can anyone suggest a reason why a woman would commit such an act? The silence that followed was the awkward silence of people who knew too much, but who were reluctant to speak. Miss Marple, however, noticed everything. She noticed how David Ashworth, Vivian's husband, had suddenly turned very pale. She noticed how his hand, which was holding a wine glass, was trembling slightly. She also noticed the way he looked at Helena, his wife's sister, with a mixture of distress and something that might have been embarrassment. He also noticed the reaction of Dr. Harrington, who had been invited to the wedding as a family friend and was now providing preliminary confirmation of the cause of death. He had paled considerably when Vivian's name was mentioned. Then he had coughed into his handkerchief, a gesture that seemed more nervous than genuinely necessary, for the next 2 hours, as the house filled with police officers and photographers. Miss Marple moved with the stillness of a ghost. She excused herself from the interrogation room and went to the dressing room, where she found the housemaid, a young girl named Susan, putting away the guests' coats. "That was a dreadful affair," Miss Marple remarked gently. "You must have been very close to the whole family. Did you notice anything unusual in the last few months?" Susan, unaware that she was being questioned by one of the sharpest minds in all of England, answered with the frankness of youth. "Well, Mrs. Ashworth, I mean. The one who just ran away always seemed sad when she came to visit, and Mr. Bancroft always seemed uncomfortable when she was in the room. My mother works at Dr. Harrington's house, and she says that he and Mrs. Ashworth used to visit each other quite often when her husband was in London." Miss Marple felt something click into place, like a key in a lock. It wasn't information that solved the mystery, but it did suggest that things were considerably more complicated than Inspector Slack seemed to think. She returned to the living room just as the inspector was announcing that a warrant had been issued for Vivian Ashworth. Her photograph would be distributed to every police station in the county. Almost certainly, the inspector said, with a confidence that Miss Marple found disturbingly premature. She would be captured before nightfall, but Miss Marple knew something that Inspector Slack didn't. She knew that people who flee typically do so for one of two reasons: because they are guilty, or because they are afraid of being falsely accused. And the expression on Vivian Ashworth's face, as Miss Marple remembered it from just a few minutes before she disappeared, was not the expression of a murderer. It was the expression of someone who had discovered something terrible, something that frightened her far more than any police officer. As the chaos continued around her, Miss Marple retreated once more to the corner with her cross-stitch. There was much to think about, and the truth, as always in these matters, lay in the small details that most people simply overlooked. The mother-of-pearl handle of the knife, the careful pattern of the blood, the door that wasn't completely closed, and now a doctor who became nervous at the mention of a woman's name. These were the threads Miss Marple needed to pull, slowly, patiently, until the whole truth unfolded. Chapter 3. The disappearance and the interrogations by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Thornfield House had transformed into something resembling a police station more than a family home. Detective Inspector Slack had established his headquarters in the dining room. Papers scattered across the mahogany table that just a week before had been the site of wedding celebrations. Police officers came and went, carrying cups of iced tea and reports of unsuccessful searches. Vivian Ashworth seemed to have completely evaporated. Miss Marple had been politely asked to remain available for further questioning, which she had accepted with her usual serene elegance. Meanwhile, she observed every movement, every reaction, every word spoken or withheld in the house. David Ashworth, Vivian's husband, had retreated to the library after his initial questioning. Miss Marple had seen him pass by in the corridor, his face ashen, his hands trembling in a way that suggested something more than mere shock. A man, thought Miss Marple, whose world was crumbling in ways she had perhaps feared for years. Dr. Harrington had been briefly questioned and then released, though not before Inspector Slack made some pointed remarks about the need for doctors to be more transparent about their patients. The doctor had left shortly after 4 o'clock, his car disappearing down the road at a speed that Miss Marple considered rather reckless given his apparent state of nerves. Margaret Bancroft, the late Christopher's daughter, had been examined again, this time in greater detail. Could she describe exactly what had happened after her father retired to his study? Had she noticed who passed by in the corridor during that time? Had she heard any noises? Margaret had been consistent in her answers, but Miss Marple noticed something significant. Whenever Vivian was mentioned, the young woman blinked rapidly. It wasn't a large gesture, but it was a gesture nonetheless. The kind of gesture that suggested suppressed emotion at about 5:30. Inspector Slack requested that Miss Marple join him in the dining room for his formal questioning. He sat opposite her with his notes, his small notebook open on the desk in front of him. There was something in his expression that suggested he felt his time had been largely wasted questioning an old woman. "Miss Marple," she began, pronouncing her name with the deliberate clarity of someone speaking to someone who might be slightly deaf, though she certainly wasn't. "You were present at the wedding. Did you notice anything unusual before the body was discovered?" "Many things, Inspector," replied Miss Marple in her characteristic gentleness, "though perhaps not the things you're looking for." Inspector Slack looked at her, his expression suggesting he was unsure how to proceed with someone who responded in such a way. "Could you be more specific, Miss—" "Good," said Miss Marple, carefully placing her knitting in her lap. "I would note that the bride, Mrs. Christopher Bancroft, was considerably nervous during the ceremony. It is not unusual, of course, for a bride to be nervous, but her nervousness seemed directed toward specific individuals rather than the general situation. In particular, she seemed anxious about not making eye contact with her sister." "Would you think this suggests complicity between them?" asked Inspector Slack, his pencil moving rapidly across the page. "Absolutely not," Miss Marple replied firmly. "I would suggest just the opposite. I would suggest conflict. A breach of trust, perhaps." Inspector Slack frowned and continued writing. "Did you notice anything else?" "The pattern of blood on the carpet," said Miss Marple, "is remarkably clean. To clean, I would say, to be consistent with what a man in a desperate state of emotional distress would do." "Are you suggesting he was murdered?" the inspector asked. "I suggest it was a carefully orchestrated event," Miss Marple replied, "by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and why." Inspector Slack put down his pencil and leaned back in his chair, examining the old woman in front of him with renewed interest. "You've given this a lot of thought, haven't you?" "I have observed a great deal in this," Miss Marple gently corrected. "The thought comes later. For the next 30 minutes, Miss Marple described to the inspector everything she had seen, the way David Ashworth had gone pale, Dr. Harrington's reaction, the peculiar paper knife letter opener, the study door that wasn't quite closed. She offered no conclusions as to what these things meant. She simply presented the observable facts, allowing Inspector Slack to draw his own conclusions. When Inspector Slack finally released her, he seemed deeply dissatisfied. He had come to investigate an obvious suicide and had found something considerably more complicated. Worse still, he seemed increasingly convinced that Vivian Ashworth was guilty, while Miss Marple was equally convinced of the contrary. It was 6:30 when Miss Marple was finally allowed to leave Thornfield House. The sun was setting over the village, tinging the church stones a deep orange. As she walked along the lane to her house, her mind worked through the facts like someone assembling a particularly challenging jigsaw puzzle. Vivian Ashworth had disappeared. Inspector Slack was convinced she was a murderer. But Miss Marple knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from 73 years of observing human nature, that they were all looking in the wrong direction. What he needed now was information about David Ashworth, information about his marriage to Vivian, information about his finances, information about exactly what had been happening in that house over the past few months. And such information, Miss Marple knew from experience, could usually be found not in official interrogations, but in whispered conversations between maids, in local shop gossip, in the small details that escaped the notice of men like Inspector Slack. She arrived at her home in the Greater Measure shortly after 7. Her housekeeper, Lucy, was waiting for her with hot tea and an expression of deep concern about the scandal that was unfolding in the village. Miss Marple sat down in her favorite chair, accepted the cup of tea offered by Lucy, and immediately began asking very precise questions about the lives of those people that Inspector Slack had not yet thought to ask. The mysteries, after all, were solved not with police violence, but with patience, observation, and a deep understanding of how people actually lived. Chapter 4. The Confessions of the People. Lucy, Miss Marple's housekeeper, was a 55-year-old woman whose network of information extended throughout St. Mary Mead like the roots of an ancient tree. Her sister worked in the bakery, her cousin was a maid in the rector's house, and her brother-in-law had been the porter at the Ashworth's house for the past 3 years. When Miss Marple phrased her questions gently as she sipped her tea, Lucy understood exactly what was being asked. Mrs. Ashworth, Lucy began, sitting down in the chair opposite Miss Marple with the familiarity that comes from years of loyal service, has been a very unhappy woman, Miss. My brother-in-law, Tom, said that things between her and Mr. Ashworth have been terrible for years. Arguments constantly, doors slamming. She often cried in her room. And Mr. Ashworth? Asked Miss Marple. How did he behave? Mostly absent, Lucy replied. He spent most of his nights in London. My brother-in-law said it seemed as if Mr. Ashworth was avoiding being home. Tom thought it was because of business, but then he overheard conversations. Mr. Ashworth didn't want to be there. He didn't want to be with her. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her teacup motionless in her hands. And Mrs. Ashworth? Did she have any friends? Anyone who visited her? Lucy lowered her voice, even though the house was completely empty except for the two of them. Dr. Harrington visited frequently, Miss. He said it was because of your nerves that you needed medicine. But Tom said the visits were, well, they were too frequent, too long. And when Mr. Ashworth was home, the doctor never visited. This confirmation of Miss Marple's suspicions provided her with a crucial piece of the puzzle. Vivian Ashworth had sought solace in the doctor's arms, probably because her marriage was an empty shell. But that still didn't explain why she would have run away after Christopher Bancroft's death. UNLESS. Lucy, said Miss Marple carefully. Do you know anything about the relationship between Mr. Christopher Bancroft and Mrs. Ashworth? Lucy hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. Tom said something curious, Miss. A few months ago, Mr. Bancroft came to speak with Mr. Ashworth. Tom was cleaning in the corridor and overheard a few words. Mr. Bancroft was furious. He said something about not being able to allow this to continue and that there were family obligations to honor. Mr. Ashworth looked terrified, as if he were about to faint. Miss Marple carefully placed her cup aside. What happened next? Mr. Bancroft stormed off, and after that, Mr. Ashworth started drinking more. Tom says he saw him at night in the library, just sitting in the dark with a glass of whiskey, staring into space. This painted a very different picture from the one Inspector Slack had constructed. Christopher Bancroft was not a passive victim of desperate circumstances. He was someone who knew something that had enraged him enough to confront his own brother. Something important enough to make him prepare for his wife's wedding almost immediately afterward. "Is there anything else Tom mentioned?" asked Miss Marple. Lucy glanced around as if, even in the privacy of Miss Marple's house, the walls might be listening. "Something strange, Miss. About 2 weeks ago, Tom saw Mr. Bancroft visiting the house again. Mr. Ashworth wasn't home, but Mrs. Ashworth saw him. Tom said he heard Mr. Bancroft speaking very harshly to her. He said there was no way out of this. The damage was already done. Mrs. Ashworth was crying, saying she didn't know what to do, that she was trapped." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, processing this information. "And when exactly did Mr. Ashworth meet Mr. Bancroft?" "That was strange too, miss," replied Lucy. "Tom said it was the night before the wedding. Mr. Ashworth came home late from London and went straight to the library. Mr. Bancroft was there waiting for him. Tom saw Mr. Bancroft go into the library with something that looked like an envelope. Tom doesn't know what was said, but when Mr. Bancroft came out, he looked as if he'd been crying, though men like him never cry, do they, miss?" Miss Marple slowly opened her eyes. The picture was now becoming clearer, although there were still considerable shadows. "Tell Tom he's been very helpful," said Miss Marple, "and that he mustn't mention any of this to anyone else. It's important, Lucy, very important." "I understand, miss," replied Lucy, clearly excited to be included in what was clearly a much more significant private investigation than Inspector Slack's. After Lucy left for the kitchen, Miss Marple sat in the decreasing darkness of her sitting room, reflecting on what she had learned. Christopher Bancroft had discovered something about his brother and his wife's sister, something that had enraged him deeply, something serious enough to have led him to confront them twice. And then, the night before his own wedding, he had a private meeting with David Ashworth, in which he had apparently handed him an envelope containing something significant enough to bring a lawyer of a certain age to the verge of tears, evidence, compromising documents, a written confession. And then, at the wedding itself, someone had killed Christopher Bancroft in a way that had been carefully orchestrated to look like a suicide. Someone who understood exactly how to manipulate a crime scene. Someone who had access to the study. Someone who knew exactly when Christopher would be alone. Vivian Ashworth disappeared shortly afterwards. But Miss Marple was becoming increasingly convinced that it wasn't because she was guilty. It was because I was afraid. Fear of the one who was really responsible. Miss Marple rose from her chair and went to her desk. She took out writing paper and a quill pen. She had some questions she needed to ask, and certain places she needed to go. Inspector Slack would continue searching for Vivian Ashworth, but Miss Marple would be searching for the truth, and the truth, as always, was hidden not in the obvious places, but in the dark corners of family secrets and the compromises people made in the privacy of their homes. Chapter 5. The missing envelope. The next morning, Miss Marple had an early breakfast and dressed carefully. She had decided that certain places needed to be visited and certain matters needed to be clarified. Her first destination was Thornfield House, where she learned from the rumors that had become public knowledge that Margaret Bancroft was being looked after by a distant aunt who had come from Somerset. When she arrived, She was greeted by the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Pemberton, whom Miss Marple had seen for years at the village market. Mrs. Pemberton, notoriously talkative when it came to the internal affairs of the house, was almost too easily persuaded to allow Miss Marple to briefly go upstairs to the main rooms. "I simply wish to express my respects to young Margaret," Miss Marple explained with her characteristic gentleness. "She must be terribly upset." Mrs. Pemberton, who was evidently eager to talk to someone about the shock of recent events, was delighted to accompany Miss Marple upstairs. As they ascended the stairs, Miss Marple began asking seemingly casual questions. "I imagine the police have examined the study quite thoroughly," he noted. "Completely upside down." "Miss," replied Mrs. Pemberton, "the inspector and his men were here until midnight last night. They moved every book, opened every drawer. They were looking for something in particular, I think, though they never said what." "Did you find anything of interest?" asked Miss Marple. "Not that I know of, Miss." Although it was strange, Mr. Bancroft always kept a large envelope on his desk, where he kept important documents for his legal cases. But when the police were here, the inspector specifically asked about that envelope. The desk was completely empty, as if someone had taken it out during the night. Miss Marple felt something click in her mind. Was the desk empty when they discovered the body? He asked carefully. "It was the first place they looked, Miss." According to Mrs. Harrington, who saw everything, the desk had papers on it when they removed the body. But when the police returned this morning with their special inspector, the desk had been completely cleaned. This meant that someone had been in the studio overnight. Someone who knew exactly where to look. Someone who understood the importance of that envelope. Miss Marple spent the next 20 minutes with Margaret, who looked so pale and frail that it seemed as if a strong wind might scatter her. The young woman was visibly anxious, her eyes red and puffy. But when Miss Marple gently inquired about her father's behavior in the days leading up to the wedding, Margaret offered information that was profoundly revealing. "He was scared," Margaret said quietly. "Not at first, but later. Especially after he saw Uncle David. He acted as if he knew something terrible was about to happen." "Did he tell you anything about what was worrying him?" asked Miss Marple. Margaret shook her head. "He just said he had to do the right thing. That no matter how painful it was what he had to do. That the family was in danger of something terrible if he didn't act." When Miss Marple finally left Thornfield House, she had learned what she needed to know. The envelope Christopher had given to his brother the night before the wedding. The same envelope Tom had apparently seen in the lawyer's hands had become an object of considerable importance. Someone had retrieved it from the desk during the night, which meant that person had been in the house after the body was discovered. Her next stop was Dr. Harrington's clinic in the village. She found him with a patient, but his receptionist, a young woman named Miss Davies, was easily persuaded to let Miss Marple wait in the doctor's private consulting room while she waited. Miss Marple examined the room with her characteristic thoroughness. The desk was tidy, but not obsessively so. There was a photograph in a silver frame, the doctor with a woman whom Miss Marple recognized as his late wife, who had died 5 years earlier. There was no photograph of Vivian Ashworth, which was itself revealing. On the desk lay an appointment book. Miss Marple, always ready to seize an opportunity, quickly flicked through the pages. The doctor's entries were brief. VA 2 p.m. VA autor. 3 depois do meio-dia. Vivian Ashworth had been seeing the doctor about twice a week for the past 3 months. But what was particularly interesting was that the most recent entry, dated exactly 1 week ago, read VA, special consultation. Delicate matter, When Dr. Harrington entered the room, he stopped abruptly at the sight of Miss Marple. The color drained from his face. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice now careful and measured. "This is an unexpected surprise. Is there anything I can do for you?" "I simply wish to express my sincere condolences on the death of Mr. Bancroft," Miss Marple replied gently. "Such a remarkable man, and so dedicated to doing the right thing, it seems." The doctor moved toward his desk with a stiffness that suggested considerable emotional strain. "It was a terrible tragedy," he replied, "although I must say I am not surprised. I have observed for some time that Mr. Bancroft was under considerable emotional strain." "Did he discuss the source of that tension with you?" asked Miss Marple. "A doctor's patients enjoy confidentiality, Miss Marple," replied the doctor. "I'm sure you'll understand." "Of course," replied Miss Marple. "Although I suppose confidentiality doesn't extend to matters relating to a murder." The doctor paled even more. "To suggest that I had anything to do with Mr. Bancroft's death would be completely inappropriate and unfounded," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm not suggesting anything of the sort," Miss Marple replied with her characteristic gentleness. "I'm merely observing that a man devoted to medicine, someone who understands precisely how to inflict wounds in a specific and controlled manner, would certainly be capable of orchestrating such a crime if properly motivated." The silence that followed was long and profound. "If you're suggesting that I killed Christopher Bancroft," the doctor finally said, "I warn you that's a very serious accusation." "I'm not accusing," Miss Marple replied. "I'm observing, and what I observe is a man who is terrified that something will be discovered, something serious enough to drive a respected lawyer to confront his own brother, something serious enough that that lawyer was murdered before he could act on it." Miss Marple got up to leave, but turned back towards the door. "The truth always comes out, Doctor, always. And when it comes out, the question you must answer is not just what happened, but why you allowed it to happen." She left the doctor sitting at his desk, his face a mask of barely contained anguish. As she walked back through the village toward her house, Miss Marple knew she had moved a crucial piece on the chessboard. The doctor knew he was no longer safe, and men who know they are not safe often make desperate mistakes. Chapter 6. The psychological game that evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. It was around 8 o'clock when Lucy announced that David Ashworth had arrived at the door, asking to see Miss Marple with some urgency. Miss Marple, who had been reading in her sitting room, asked to be shown to him at once. David Ashworth looked as if he hadn't slept in 36 hours. His usually neatly combed hair was disheveled. His eyes had that feverish gleam of someone who'd been drinking. He moved with the restlessness of a caged animal. "Miss Marple," he began without preamble, "I must speak to you about what happened. About Christopher. About everything." Miss Marple offered him a seat, which he declined. Instead, he began pacing the room. "I've heard you've been asking questions," he continued. "Questions that suggest you understand more than most people do. The police are watching me. Detective Inspector Slack seems convinced Vivian is responsible, but you know that's not the case, don't you?" "What I do know," Miss Marple replied calmly, "is that things are seldom simple, and crimes frequently arise from circumstances that most people would consider, in their own lives, perfectly understandable." David sat down abruptly, as if his legs could no longer support his weight. "Christopher discovered something," she said softly. Something he shouldn't have discovered. Something he should never have known. And what was it? Asked Miss Marple. The real reason my marriage is the way it is, David replied. The real reason Vivian has been so unhappy for years. Christopher was a meticulous lawyer. When he learned Vivian was seeing Dr. Harrington, he investigated. He uncovered medical records. He discovered things my wife had hidden, things I had helped to hide. Miss Marple waited. She knew, from experience, that men who confessed generally needed to be heard completely before they could be interrupted. Vivian can't have children, David continued, his voice cracking slightly. She never could. It's a condition. A condition we were diagnosed with 8 years ago, shortly after we were married. I spent years blaming her. Years feeling as though I'd been betrayed. But the truth is, it wasn't her fault. It was a biological misfortune, and she tried everything. Treatments, doctors. Dr. Harrington was especially gentle with her, understanding. Eventually, she fell in love with him. It wasn't a passionate affair, but a matter of gratitude. Of someone who treated her as if her inability to produce an heir didn't make her utterly worthless. Miss Marple now understood part of the mystery, but not the whole story yet. And Christopher? She asked gently. How did he find this out? Because his wife, sweet Helena, who just married him, knew, David replied bitterly. She knew about Vivian, and when Christopher started making plans to marry, Helena told him everything. She thought he deserved to know that his brother was married to a barren woman. She thought it was relevant information. And how did Christopher react? Asked Miss Marple. With horror, David replied. Not for Vivian's sake, but for the implications. Christopher was a man of principle. When he learned that Dr. Harrington was in an inappropriate relationship with his patient, a patient in a state of considerable emotional vulnerability, he was furious. He saw this as exploitation, a breach of professional trust. He threatened to file a formal complaint with the medical association. Now, finally, the picture was coming together. And then, David continued, his voice trembling. Christopher summoned Dr. Harrington and told him he had 1 week to end the relationship, to acknowledge his inappropriate behavior or face the consequences. The doctor was desperate. He came to see me. He begged me to speak to Christopher, to convince him to change his mind. But I couldn't do that. Christopher was right. What the doctor had done was inexcusable, and asked Miss Marple. Did she know about these threats? I told her, David replied. I thought she had a right to know. Christopher confronted her, too. He told her that what she had done was selfish, that she had allowed a man to exploit her vulnerabilities for his own pleasure. It was cruel, though he was right. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, and then Vivian disappeared. Not immediately, David replied. First, she tried to deny everything. Then, during the wedding, when she saw Christopher, it was as if something broke inside her. She realized, I think, the magnitude of what Christopher was about to do. How his confession would destroy not only Dr. Harrington, but also her reputation, everything she had built. David got up and went to the window, looking out into the dark night. But I didn't kill him, Miss Marple, although I certainly thought about it, although I certainly would have been justified in doing so. Christopher being murdered during his own wedding at his brother's house would have been the perfect culmination of an already perfect tragedy. But it wasn't me. Miss Marple watched David carefully. She believed he was telling the truth, at least about his own guilt. But she also believed he wasn't telling her the whole story. "And where is Vivian now?" he asked. David hesitated for a long moment. "I don't know," he finally replied. "She disappeared after Christopher was murdered. But I think I know where she might be. And I think she knows who did it." "Why?" asked Miss Marple. "Because when I left the studio after they discovered the body, I saw Vivian in the hallway. I saw the expression on her face. It was the expression of someone who had just grasped the truth. The expression of someone who understood that the person she loved had committed a terrible mistake. An act of violence motivated by love." Miss Marple felt the weight of the truth descend upon her like a heavy blanket. "Are you suggesting," he asked slowly, "that Dr. Harrington killed Christopher Bancroft?" "I'm not suggesting anything," David replied. "I'm just stating what I saw." After David left, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room, reflecting on all she had learned. Dr. Harrington had had the motive. He had had the opportunity. He had the knowledge of how to inflict the wound in a specific way that would make it look like suicide. But one crucial question remained unanswered. If Vivian knew Dr. Harrington was responsible, where was she? And why hadn't she gone to the police? The answer, Miss Marple knew, was both simple and complex. Vivian loved the doctor. And love, that most dangerous human emotion, made people do irrational things. Miss Marple stood up and walked to her desk. She had a letter to write. A letter that would change everything. Chapter 7. The woven traptha next morning. Miss Marple sent a letter addressed to Dr. Harrington. It was not an accusatory or threatening letter. Instead, it was an invitation to tea at her house at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The letter was written in her characteristic handwriting, careful and precise, and bore the mark of someone whose social standing in the village was beyond question. "I have matters which I would like to discuss with you concerning a mutual patient," Miss Marple wrote with deliberate ambiguity. "Matters which I believe would benefit from a private conversation between us. I hope you can find some time in your busy schedule." The doctor replied around noon. He would accept the invitation at 3:00 single quotes. Miss Marple spent the next few hours preparing herself carefully. Not for the tea itself, although Lucy had prepared cucumber sandwiches and small fruitcakes. She was preparing for a psychological confrontation that would require all the skill her 73 years had afforded her. He had formulated a plan during the night. A plan that Inspector Slack would never have considered. A plan that operated under the assumption that the perfect crime was not the one the criminals thought they had committed, but the one that forced them to reveal their guilt through fear and despair. Dr. Harrington arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, his professional precision evident in his punctuality. He carried his medical bag, a detail Miss Marple noticed immediately. He wore his professionalism like a shield. Dr. Harrington greeted Miss Marple as Lucy showed him into the living room. "How kind of you to come. Please, have a seat. I've made some tea." The doctor sat down, visibly uneasy. His eyes scanned the room as if searching for an escape. Miss Marple poured the tea with perfect calm, her hands completely steady. "I have been reflecting on the unfortunate matter of Mr. Bancroft's death," Miss Marple began, as if they were merely discussing the weather. "And I have come to certain conclusions which I believe may be of interest to you." "I'm not sure what the purpose of such a conversation would be," Miss Marple replied the doctor. His voice was controlled, but Miss Marple detected an underlying tremor. "The purpose," Miss Marple continued without interruption, "is simple. A man has been murdered. The police are looking in the wrong direction. investigating a woman whose only crime was seeking comfort in the arms of a man who understood her. But I think you and I both know who was really responsible. The doctor placed his teacup on the side table. His hands were trembling noticeably now. You're suggesting something very serious, he said in a low voice. I am not suggesting, Miss Marple replied. I am observing. I am observing a man who is under considerable stress. I am observing a man whose career, whose reputation, is in danger of being completely destroyed by the actions of a morally rigid lawyer. I am observing a man who has the knowledge, the opportunity, and, most importantly, the motive to commit an act of desperate violence. That's completely speculative, protested the doctor, though his voice had become almost inaudible. Perhaps, Miss Marple conceded. But consider this, a silver letter opening paper knife, taken from Christopher Bancroft's desk, used to inflict a wound with surgical precision. A wound that, under certain circumstances, could appear a crime scene manipulation that only someone familiar with anatomy would fully understand. The doctor stood up abruptly. I don't have to listen to this, she said. No, certainly not, Miss Marple replied calmly. But I can suggest that the police will find what they are looking for once they examine certain areas of your clinic more carefully, particularly your patient files, particularly the records that indicate treatments for problems that are beyond the ordinary medical scope. The doctor froze. How did he know? He began, then stopped. I have lived in this village for many years, Miss Marple replied. I know its secrets, its petty scandals, its little betrayals, and I know the stories the maids whisper when they think no one is listening. A maid in this house, whose cousin works for you, accidentally mentioned certain treatments she administered to patients who were not really ill. Treatments that resembled personal favors more than medical services. The doctor crumbled. He literally crumbled, sitting in the chair looking like a man whose world had turned to sand beneath his feet. She wanted to die, she said softly. After everything Christopher did to her, after humiliating her, after threatening to ruin my career, she just wanted to die. She asked me for medicine. She asked me to help her. And did he help her? Miss Marple asked, gently. Not so, the doctor replied, his face buried in his hands. I gave her tranquilizers. Enough to make her sleep for days, but not enough to kill her. I thought that if she simply slept long enough, perhaps she could wake up in a different world. A world where Christopher hadn't humiliated her. But then, how did Christopher die? Asked Miss Marple. The doctor raised his head, his eyes now completely empty. I didn't know she was planning to come to the wedding, he said. She came looking for him. She came to the house because her sister asked her to come. And she saw Christopher coming out of the study. She begged him not to do what he was about to do. She pleaded with him to have mercy. But he said terrible things to her. He told her she was a weak, pathetic woman. He told her she deserved to be afraid. He told her he was going to destroy everything around her because she wasn't strong enough to live. Miss Marple closed her eyes. And what happened then? He asked. She ran toward the study. The doctor continued. He went in after her. I followed her. I don't know why. I suppose I didn't want her to be alone. And when I saw him take her arm, when I saw him speak to her that way, when I saw the utter despair in his eyes, it just happened. The knife was there. He had his back to me. It was as if my hand acted without my mind's permission. A reflex action of a man who loved a woman and couldn't bear to see her suffer for one more moment. And then, asked Miss Marple, Then I staged the scene, the doctor replied in a voice that seemed to come from afar. I closed the door. I put the knife in her hand. I made it look like suicide. It was the only thing I could do. And then I left. And Vivian, when she came out of the study, when she saw what had happened, she understood. She understood that I had done it for her. And she left. She simply left, because she knew that if she stayed, if she said anything, she would accuse me. The silence that followed was profound and absolute. Where is she now? Asked Miss Marple. At the train station, the doctor replied, waiting for a train to London. I thought that if she disappeared, if she left, then the blame would fall on her. The police would look for her. I would be free. Miss Marple got up slowly. The police must know the truth, he said. The whole truth. And Mrs. Ashworth must be found, not because she is guilty, but because she must be protected from herself. The doctor didn't protest. He simply sat in the chair, staring into space. A man destroyed by passion and despair. Miss Marple called Lucy and asked her to bring Inspector Slack. Chapter 8. The revealed truth. Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's house at about 4:30 in the afternoon, accompanied by 2 police officers. His initial expression was one of considerable irritation. An old village girl shouldn't be calling the police without a truly substantial reason. But when he entered the living room and saw Dr. Harrington sitting in the chair, completely motionless, his expression changed dramatically. What is the meaning of this, Miss Marple? Demanded the inspector. That is the meaning of justice, Inspector, Miss Marple replied calmly. Dr. Harrington has something he would like to tell you. Preferably in private, although I believe the facts of the case must be made public so that full justice may be done to all parties involved. The doctor rose slowly. He moved like an automaton, as if the connection between his mind and body had been severed. He asked to speak with the inspector under the conditions of having a lawyer present, as was his right. But before he could be taken away, before the formality of the law could take hold, he said something that changed everything. Vivian Ashworth is at the train station, he said, on platform 3, waiting for a train to London. She is in danger of harming herself. They must find her immediately. Inspector Slack acted with a speed that Miss Marple would not have believed. He dispatched the 2 officers to the railway station with specific instructions to bring Mrs. Ashworth back to the village under protection, not as a criminal, but as a witness. He then proceeded to read Dr. Harrington his rights while preparing him for transport to the police station. But before they took him away, the doctor asked to speak with Miss Marple. She'll never understand, he said, why I did what I did, because she's never known the kind of love that destroys everything it touches. She came to me 8 years ago, a woman broken by her inability to be what her society demanded she be, and for 8 years I helped her. It wasn't romantic love at first, but something deeper. It was the realization that her circumstances weren't her fault, that she deserved better than the life she'd been given. I understand, Miss Marple replied gently. I understand more than you might think. But understanding doesn't change what must happen now. The law must take its course, and her, asked the doctor, referring to Vivian. She will live, Miss Marple replied. Perhaps not as she would have liked to live, but she will live. And that is the hope we should all keep in our hearts. Vivian Ashworth was found on platform 3 of the railway station, exactly as the doctor had described. She was sitting on a wooden bench, a small suitcase beside her, holding a bottle of pills. When officers approached her, She initially tried to throw herself onto the tracks, but was stopped by one of the officers whose composure and compassion prevented what would have been a further tragedy. She was taken to the police station in a state of profound shock. Her first question, when she was finally able to speak, was whether the doctor was safe, whether he had been captured, whether he was being treated unfairly. It was clear to everyone present that she still loved him, even knowing what he had done, even understanding that his actions had been criminal. Inspector Slack, after consulting with the doctor's lawyer, began to piece together the case. What emerged was a story of crime born not of hatred, but of love perverted by circumstances. Christopher Bancroft had discovered the inappropriate relationship between the doctor and Vivian. As a lawyer of rigid principles, he had decided to act, but his actions had been merciless. He had humiliated Vivian instead of protecting her. He had threatened to destroy the career of the man who loved her. And when she had come to him at the wedding, pleading for mercy, he had responded with cruelty. The doctor, present in the house as a casual guest, had witnessed everything, and in a moment of passion that he would later regret for the rest of his life, he had acted, not for himself, but for a woman he loved and who had been under his care for years. A week later, Miss Marple was visited again by David Ashworth, but this time he didn't come to confess or seek absolution. He came to give thanks. "Vivian is in a healthcare facility in Sussex," he said. "A place dedicated to people who have suffered emotional breakdowns. Doctors say that with time and care, she will recover. She will not be prosecuted." The inspector determined that she was an accomplice after the fact in concealing the truth. But given her emotional state, there is no basis for more serious charges. "And you?" asked Miss Marple. "I've accepted that my marriage is over," David replied. "But instead of dissolving it bitterly, I've decided that Vivian will be cared for. Not out of love that ships sank years ago, but because a man has certain duties toward a woman with whom he has shared his life, even if that life wasn't what either of us would have chosen." Miss Marple nodded, satisfied that at least some part of this tragedy resulted in something resembling redemption. "Is there anything you'd like to know?" David asked. "Only one thing," Miss Marple replied. "How did Christopher know the truth?" "Helena," David replied. "My wife found out by accident. She visited the doctor's clinic for a routine checkup and saw Vivian leaving a private appointment. Helena recognized Vivian immediately, and when she casually mentioned it to Christopher, something about what she said alerted him. As a lawyer, he investigated, and when he discovered the truth, he couldn't let it go. He had to act. He had to expose what he considered exploitation. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "The road to hell," he said gently, "is paved with good intentions." Dr. Harrington was tried for murder. His defense was that he had acted in a moment of temporary insanity, driven by love and despair. He was convicted not of murder, but of manslaughter, a distinction that reflected the court's understanding that although he had committed a criminal act, the circumstances were to some extent understandable. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. When he was led from the courthouse, he didn't look back. His life, as he had known it, was over, and the only consolation he could find was that Vivian would live on, though not with him. Months later, when the commotion had slowly faded from the village, Miss Marple sat in her garden one spring afternoon. The roses were beginning to bloom again, as they did every year. As they would every year, no matter how dark the stories unfolding in the lives of the men. Lucy brought her tea, and Miss Marple reflected on the nature of crime, the nature of passion, and the way in which civilized societies built barriers against these things. Even though they could never completely eliminate them, the mystery was solved. The truth was out. But Miss Marple knew, as she always knew, that in the hearts of the men and women of St. Mary Mead, the truly important questions would remain unanswered. Could society permit passion, or should it be stifled in the name of decency? Could compassion justify crime, or should the law remain absolute? Could people live in a society that demanded they deny who and what they truly were? These were questions Miss Marple would never fully answer, but she understood them in the way only someone who had observed humanity for 73 years could. Chapter 9. The Scars of Time. 6 months after Dr. Harrington's conviction, St. Mary Mead had returned to its apparent tranquility. The town, as towns always do, had absorbed the scandal, chewed it over, digested it, and finally filed it away in the mental archives of those terrible things that happened a while ago. The gossip had died down. The furtive glances had ceased. Life had resumed its ordinary rhythm. But for those who had been more deeply involved, the scars remained. Margaret Bancroft had returned to Thornfield House after spending the summer with her aunt in Somerset. She was a different young woman than the one who had left the village, quieter, more introspective. She spent long hours in her father's library, reading books that seemed far too mature for her 16 years. Miss Marple had seen her at the market shortly after her return, and the change was evident. Her father's death had aged her soul in a way that years could not. Miss Marple sent Margaret an invitation to have tea with her one afternoon in early October. The young woman accepted with a formality that suggested she understood exactly why she was being invited. "I wanted you to know," Miss Marple began once they were seated with their tea and small cakes, "that what happened to your father was not your fault. A considerable burden has been resting on your shoulders, I think, the burden of feeling that you are somehow responsible." Margaret lifted her head, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "How did he know?" she asked in a low voice. "Because I know the burden of a sense of responsibility," Miss Marple replied. "It's a burden many people carry, especially young ones who are sensitive and perceptive. But you must understand that your father made his own choices. He made his own decisions. You couldn't have stopped him, even if you had known exactly what he was going to do." "But if it had been kindergarten," Margaret protested. "If I had spent more time with him instead of wallowing in my own problems." "Your father was a grown man," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "His salvation was not your responsibility. This is a very important thing you must learn now, while you are still young. The lives of other adults are not our burdens to bear. We can offer love, we can offer support, but we cannot assume responsibility for their actions or their consequences." Margaret remained silent for several minutes, processing this. Finally, she asked, "Do you think the doctor was bad?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that the doctor was a man who found himself in an impossible situation and made a choice which, although criminal, was motivated by something many people would recognize as love. That doesn't excuse him, but neither does it make him a monster. Life is seldom that simple." Helena Bancroft had quietly filed for divorce from Christopher shortly after his death. Technically, she couldn't divorce a dead man, but she could dissolve the financial obligations she had assumed when she married him. It was learned that she had left for London, where she was presumably seeking a more independent life, away from the whispers and prying eyes of the village. But before leaving, he had visited Miss Marple one last time. "I wanted you to know," said Helena, sitting stiffly on the edge of her chair in Miss Marple's sitting room, that I deeply regret revealing Vivian's secrets to Christopher. I know that's what started it all. If only I had kept quiet. If she had kept silent, interrupted Miss Marple, perhaps someone else would have discovered the truth. Secrets have a way of coming out, Miss Bancroft. Secrets always find a way. What matters is not whether they are revealed, but how we respond to the truth once it has been revealed. Do you think I was cruel? Helena asked. By telling Christopher about Vivian's disability. I believe, replied Miss Marple, that you were operating on the assumption that Christopher deserved to know all the facts about his future in-laws. An understandable, if perhaps naive, assumption. But your intention was not to cause harm. That was an unforeseen consequence of your disclosure. The difference is important. Helena left St. Mary Mead soon afterwards, and Miss Marple never heard from her again. David Ashworth had set up funds for Vivian's long-term care at the Sussex nursing home. He visited his wife monthly, though she rarely acknowledged him or spoke to him during these visits. Vivian had withdrawn completely from the world, a fact that doctors attributed to a profound emotional breakdown rather than any physical illness. But Miss Marple, who maintained her correspondence with one of the doctors in the lavatory, learned that Vivian was slowly improving. Some days she was completely lucid. Other days she sank back into the fog of depression that seemed to be her default state. But she was moving forward, even if only by small steps. Inspector Slack had received a promotion after solving the Christopher Bancroft case. His superior, seemingly unaware that the inspector had been completely off track until Miss Marple had set him straight, had praised his meticulous investigative work and determination to uncover the truth. The inspector, not being a man given to introspection, accepted the praise without questioning how much of the truth he had actually uncovered. Miss Marple, who would have found this almost comical were it not for its more serious implications, had not corrected the record. She knew that men like Inspector Slack needed their illusions of competence to function. That the truth was that a professional police officer had been outmaneuvered by a 73-year-old village woman was information that could undermine his confidence in ways that would be detrimental to his future performance. In October, shortly before winter arrived, Miss Marple received a letter from prison. It was from Dr. Harrington, a letter she answered cautiously but compassionately. He wrote that he had accepted her imprisonment, that he understood the justice of her punishment, but that he needed to know Vivian was being cared for. Miss Marple wrote back, assuring him that her former patient was being properly cared for, that she was slowly improving, that she might eventually be able to rebuild some sort of life, though certainly not the life either of them would have wanted for her. There can be no complete redemption in this world, Miss Marple wrote to the doctor. Only acceptance of what has happened, recognition of why it happened, and the hope that perhaps, some distant future, the scales of justice will be balanced not by retribution but by mercy. One evening, when winter had fully arrived at St. Mary Mead, when the snow covered the fields around the village like a blanket of forgiveness, Miss Marple sat in her chair by the fire with her cross-stitch. Her hands moved over her familiar patterns, weaving colored threads into ever more intricate shapes. Lucy asked him if it had been a particularly difficult case. This Christopher Bancroft wedding affair, it wasn't the crime that was difficult, Miss Marple replied slowly. Crimes are generally simple in their motivations, if one looks deeply enough. What was difficult was the realization that almost everyone involved was a victim of circumstances beyond their control. The doctor was a victim of his compassion. Vivian was a victim of her biology and societal expectations. Christopher was a victim of his own rigid moral sense. And young Margaret was a victim simply of being present when the tragedy unfolded. And the killer? Lucy asked. She was a victim too, Miss Marple replied. A victim of loving someone else more than she loved her own freedom. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and Miss Marple went on knitting, her needles moving their ancient dance as she pondered the mysteries of human nature that seemed to have no solution, only understanding. Chapter 10. The reflection in the mirror. Spring arrived once more at St. Mary Mead, bringing with it the eternal cycle of renewal that characterized English villages. Flowers bloomed in the gardens. Birds built their nests. Life, with its stubborn persistence, carried on as if there had been no murder, no revelation of dark secrets, no destruction of lives. Exactly 1 year after the wedding of Christopher Bancroft and Helena Ashworth, Miss Marple received a visit she hadn't quite anticipated. Vivian Ashworth, accompanied by a nurse provided by the sanitarium, arrived at the Major Measure in a hired car. Vivian had changed considerably. She was still thin. She still possessed that fragility that characterized her. But there was something in her eyes that suggested that she had at least begun the process of returning from the abyss into which she had plunged. "Miss Marple," said Vivian, standing in the living room as if unsure whether she had the right to sit, "I've wanted to visit her for months. My doctor suggested that perhaps doing so would be beneficial. As part of my recovery, I think." "Please, have a seat," Miss Marple replied with her usual politeness. "Lucy, could you bring some tea, please?" As the tea was being served, Vivian struggled to find the right words. Finally she said, "I wanted to understand it. To understand you, I mean. How you knew, how you saw through all of this when the police couldn't." "I simply observed," Miss Marple replied. "I observed the patterns of human behavior that I have seen repeated for 73 years. I observed that people act according to their natures, not according to the roles that society assigns them. And I observed that love, although it is the noblest emotion that mankind possesses, is also the most dangerous when combined with despair." "Do you blame me?" Vivian asked. "Blame," replied Miss Marple. "No, my dear. Blame is too simplistic a concept for situations like yours. You were a woman caught between what you were and what you were supposed to be. You were a woman who made the mistake of seeking comfort in the arms of someone who understood you. That wasn't guilt. That was human." Vivian began to cry silently, the tears flowing without drama, as if she had been holding them in 4 years and was finally allowed to let them out. "He says," Vivian said when she was finally able to speak, "that he did it because he loved me. That he couldn't bear to see me suffer. But I've spent the last year suffering much more than before, and he's in prison. So I don't understand how his action was an act of love. It just seems like an act of destruction." "They are often the same thing," Miss Marple replied gently. "Acts of love and acts of destruction frequently share the same source. The difference is simply whether the result ends up being constructive or destructive. In this case, it was destructive. But that doesn't mean the initial impulse was evil. It only means it was poorly executed." "Do you think I should visit him?" Vivian asked. "In prison? I believe," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that this is a decision only you can make. If you visit him, it must be for your own healing, not his. You must do it because you need to see him, to talk to him, to achieve some kind of closure. You must not do it because you feel obliged, or because you think you owe him something. You have suffered enough." Vivian nodded slowly, as if she understood, though not completely. "Is there anything else you would like to know?" asked Miss Marple. "Yes," Vivian replied after a moment. "Do you think I'll ever be happy? After all this, after everything that's happened?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. It was a question she had learned to consider carefully, because the answer she gave would affect the course of this woman's life. "Happiness," she finally replied, "is a state we pursue but rarely fully attain. What I do believe is possible is a kind of peace, an acceptance of what has happened, an understanding of why it happened, and a conscious decision to build a life that is meaningful, even if it isn't perfect. That's the best most of us can hope for, Mrs. Ashworth." After Vivian left, Miss Marple sat down again in her chair by the fireplace. Lucy had left her knitting on the side table, and Miss Marple picked it up, continuing the patterns she had started weeks before. It was a grey sweater, the kind Miss Marple had knitted hundreds of times. It wasn't a particularly remarkable or innovative project. It was simply the kind of work her hands knew so well that she could do it while her mind wandered elsewhere. And what his mind was thinking about was the nature of justice, a question that had become more complicated over the years, rather than simpler. Society built its legal systems on the assumption that justice was binary, guilty or innocent, right or wrong. But Miss Marple had spent enough years observing humanity to know that life was rarely that simple. People committed crimes not because they were evil, but because they were caught in circumstances beyond their control. Dr. Harrington was imprisoned for murder, but it was a murder born of love. Christopher Bancroft was dead for acting on his own moral principles without considering the complexities of the situation. Vivian was psychologically shattered by circumstances beyond her control, and Margaret was prematurely aged by the loss of her father. Where was justice in all of this? The answer, Miss Marple knew, was that justice was never perfect. It could only be an imperfect approximation of what was right, delivered by imperfect systems through imperfect people. 2 years later, in 1935, Miss Marple received news that Dr. Harrington had been released after serving 2/3 of his sentence, an early release that was the result of his good behavior and Vivian's renewed pleas on his behalf. Vivian, who had now spent 3 years in the infirmary and had gradually returned to some semblance of normalcy, visited the prison doctor regularly. It wasn't a romantic reconciliation that would be too simplistic, too cinematic. It was something more complex, to people who had been defined by an act of violence and who needed to find a way to live with that. Definition, Miss Marple learned, through the usual village news networks, that Vivian had begun filing for a formal divorce from David Ashworth. She was considering leaving for the continent, perhaps France or Italy, where she could start anew, away from the judgmental eyes of English society, and that Dr. Harrington, freed from his imprisonment, was considering doing the same. That perhaps, in some uncertain future, they might meet again, this time as redeemed individuals rather than those entangled in passion. Miss Marple didn't know if this was a happy ending or simply a practical one, but she did know it was an ending the characters involved had had to construct for themselves, with their own hands, through years of suffering and reflection. In the spring of 1936, Miss Marple completed the grey sweater she had been knitting for so long. She examined it with the satisfaction of one who has completed a long project with consistent competence. It was an ordinary sweater. Nothing about it suggested that it had been knitted during the months when a mystery was unfolding at St. Mary Mead. But that was the point. Ordinary life went on while extraordinary dramas unfolded. The fabric continued to weave. The seasons changed. People were born and died. And the mysteries, when finally solved, simply revealed that humanity was capable of both terrible cruelty and remarkable compassion. Miss Marple placed the sweater in a box lined with tissue paper. She would send it to a charity for poor children. Someone would use it. Someone would keep them warm through a harsh winter. And that was enough. That was, in fact, the only thing any of us could hope to do. Carry out our small actions, weave our small patterns, and hope that in the grand tapestry of life, our contributions would make some difference. Miss Marple sat in her chair, her knitting needles at rest for the first time in months, and reflected on how the mysteries of human life seldom had entirely satisfactory solutions, only understanding, and, with understanding, perhaps, some kind of peace. Chapter 11. The Epilogue. The Nature of Mystery. Winter of 1937 was particularly cold in St. Mary, Mead. The snow fell with a persistence that suggested nature itself was determined to cleanse the village of any remnants of past scandals. Miss Marple, now 75, spent most of her days by her fireplace, her knitting perpetually in her hands, her eyes still sharp despite the years that had passed. It was an afternoon in January, when she received a letter written in handwriting she didn't immediately recognize. The envelope came from France, from Provence specifically, where mimosa trees bloomed even in winter. Miss Marple opened the letter with quiet curiosity, though she knew before reading it who had written it. "Dear Miss Marple," the letter began, "I have written this letter many times in my mind, but only now have I found the courage to put it on paper. My life has taken a course I never would have anticipated when I arrived in town 2 years ago. A course which, though not one I would have chosen, is at least one I can travel with some measure of peace. Vivian and I have settled in a small village near a vineyard. She has started teaching French to local children, something she seems to find fulfilling. I have opened a small clinic where I treat the poor in the area. We work together, not as husband and wife, but as two people who have been shaped by extraordinary circumstances and who have decided to do the best they can with what life has given us. I don't expect the world to understand this. I don't expect those in England who know our history to approve of the choices we've made. But I wanted you to know that it was your understanding during that terrible day in your living room that allowed me to accept what I had done and begin the long process of living with it. Sincerely, Dr. Edmund Harrington. Miss Marple read the letter twice. Then she placed it carefully in her lap and looked out the window, where the snow continued to fall with its characteristic silence. Lucy went in to ask if Miss Marple needed anything, but stopped short when she saw the expression on her employer's face. There was something about that expression that suggested her elderly mistress was contemplating matters beyond the immediate present. "Lucy," said Miss Marple after a moment, "have you ever thought how strange it is that people commit the acts they commit?" "I'm not sure what you mean, miss," Lucy replied cautiously. "I mean," Miss Marple continued, "that Dr. Harrington, a man of medicine, a man dedicated to alleviating suffering, committed an act of violence. But he did it not out of hatred, but out of a form of love so distorted by despair that it became completely unrecognizable. And now, years later, he is finding redemption, not in denying what he did, but in consciously building a life that somehow makes up for what was destroyed. Do you think that's fair, miss?" Lucy asked. "No," Miss Marple replied. "Justice is a concept that works well in theory but consistently fails in practice. What I believe, is better. What I believe is genuine humanity, which is far rarer and more valuable than ordinary justice. That night, Miss Marple wrote a reply to the doctor. It wasn't a long letter. She simply wrote, "My dear doctor, your letter arrived on a particularly cold winter's day, which is no doubt an insignificant coincidence, but which seemed fitting somehow. I have spent the last 2 years reflecting on the events that brought our lives together in such an extraordinary way, and I have come to the conclusion that human life is infinitely more complex than our social systems can accommodate. You have found a life built on acceptance of what was, an understanding of why it was, and a determination to make the best of what remains. That is, in my experience, about as close as any of us can get to what might be called true virtue. I wish you and Mrs. Ashworth all the best in your new lives in France. Affectionately, Miss Marple." In the years that followed, Miss Marple continued to live at St. Mary Mead, knitting her patterns, observing her village, and occasionally solving minor mysteries when they arose. But the case of Christopher Bancroft, the death that had caused the collapse and eventual redemption of several lives, stayed with her in a way different from other cases. It was this case that finally taught him that the answers to life's big questions, why people do what they do, how we live with the consequences of our actions, whether any form of redemption is possible, could not be found simply by observing superficial behavior. They had to be found by looking deep into the abyss of the human heart. Margaret Bancroft eventually married an Oxford literature professor. According to reports reaching Miss Marple through various channels, she was a serious but happy woman who would never forget her father's death, but had learned to live with that knowledge in a mature and thoughtful manner. David Ashworth had stayed in the village, though his life had been considerably simplified after his divorce from Vivian. Miss Marple saw him occasionally at the market, a man who seemed to have aged a decade in the 2 years since the murder. But he also seemed, in his own quiet way, at peace, as if he had finally understood that he could not control the actions of others, only his own responses to those actions. Helena, Christopher's brief fiancée, never returned to St. Mary Mead. It was learned that she had become a writer, that she lived in Paris, and that she had built a life entirely different from the one she would have had she remained married to Christopher Bancroft. Miss Marple often wondered whether Helena understood that, strangely, she had been freed by her husband's death from a marriage that would have been unhappy. But that was the kind of understanding each person had to reach for themselves. In 1940, as Europe was descending into the darkness of war, Miss Marple received one last letter, again from France, but this time the handwriting was less steady, as if it had been written by someone whose health was failing. "Dear Miss Marple," the doctor wrote, "circumstances in Europe are becoming increasingly dangerous, and I cannot guarantee that communications will remain possible. I wanted to write one last time to tell you that Vivian and I have decided that our life together, although not in the way either of us would have wished, has been meaningful. We have helped over 100 people in our little clinic in Provence. We have built something of value, and perhaps, in the eyes of God or the universe, that counts for something. You taught me, that day in your sitting room, that life is never simply black and white, that good and evil are interwoven in ways that defy our simple categories. I will die knowing this, and it is a comfort. God bless you always. Dr. Harrington." Miss Marple never heard from the doctor again after that letter. She assumed, though she could never confirm it, that he had died during the difficult years of the German occupation, that Vivian had found some refuge, some place where she could continue living. But she didn't know for sure. What he did know, sitting in his chair by the fireplace in 1945, when the war finally ended, was that human life was an extraordinarily fragile and precious thing, that the true mysteries were not the mysteries of who had committed what crime, but the mysteries of how people found the strength to go on living after their lives had been shattered. Miss Marple continued knitting. Her needles moved in their familiar patterns, weaving threads into shapes that had existed for hundreds of years. And as she knitted, she thought of all those whose lives she had touched, whose stories she had helped to unravel, whose secrets she had helped to reveal. I was thinking about how knowing the truth could both heal and destroy. I was thinking about how compassion and justice were often in conflict. I was thinking about how living a good life, in the end, wasn't about avoiding mistakes, because mistakes were inevitable, but about responding to mistakes with integrity and courage. And while the outside world continued its wars and conflicts, Miss Marple knitted in silence, an old woman who had seen enough of human nature to know that the real mystery was never the crime itself, but the broken hearts that committed it.